Okay, Jen, we are live.
Hi, my name is Jen Johans, and I'm here on behalf of Scottsdale, Arizona's Poison Pen Bookstore. My good friend Jason Bailey, who is the author of the remarkable new biography, yes, Gandolfini, Jim, Tony, and the Life of a Legend. Jason, this is such a joy to have you here. As I was telling
Thank you.
Patrick off air, you're one of my oldest critic friends, and you're just a wonderful writer and a great human. So thank you for doing this.
Well, I really appreciate the invite. It was really kind of you to have me. I'm excited to be doing a virtual event. It feels like we're back in COVID again, so that's fun. And
Yeah,
and I'm really thrilled to do it. So thanks for having me.
absolutely. So congratulations on the book, which is coming
Thank
out
you.
in a few days.
Mhm.
But I know you've been doing your book tour. So how's that been going?
It's really been good. It's always a little awkward when you're doing the pre-release events. I was in Los Angeles last week, um, primarily because my kids were on spring break, so that was a week that it was okay for me to leave for several days. Like my help was not needed to get people out of bed and fed and lunches made and out the doors. So that was just, it just happened to fall a couple of weeks before publication date. So I was doing some events and we had some screenings. We watched some of Gandolfini's films, but
Yeah.
it's always a little awkward when like no one has actually read the book yet, and they're just all like, I bet it's good. But it was fun. We got to watch some good films and meet some fans and do the LA thing for a few days.
I love LA, and I'm so glad that you got to show movies at the American Cinematheque there.
Yeah,
I did
yeah.
that last August with White Palace for my podcast, and that was a lot of
Right.
fun. Yeah. So, did you get to curate the movies and select which Gandolfini titles?
What I did with all of these events, and then I've got three coming up this week in New York, is basically I kind of sent a list of suggestions, like I based on the movies where he's doing something interesting, where the rest of the movie is also good,
Yeah.
um, where it has at least some name recognition, and then sort of as more events were added, I would pluck off the ones that another venue had already chosen from. But for each, when we started planning both the LA and the New York swings, it was a quite, I had a list of about 12 titles that seemed like good ones that sort of fit all the criteria, and they sort of selected from those the ones that they were most excited to show, or that they thought their audience would respond to, and we just kind of went from there.
Perfect. Well, we already have people that are wondering about your past books, which I love. He is a great film historian. And I wanted
Thank
to
you.
ask, that kind of dovetails right into my first question, which is how things got started. Had this been an idea that you wanted to cover? I do remember after Gandolfini passed away, you wrote something very beautiful. I think it was for like Flavor Wire.
It was for Flavor Wire. Yeah, I
Yeah.
was I was film editor at Flavor Wire when he passed in 2013, and I wrote sort of a quick, immediate emotion reaction. There were a lot of those going around because his death was so shocking. He was only 51 years old, which I think sometimes we forget, because it felt like he had been with us for a pretty good while by then. But
Yes.
he really had only been actively working in the public eye, being in films of note, for about 20 years.
Mhm.
So I wrote something then. I've always had a tremendous amount of affection for him.
Yeah.
But the route to this book becoming a book was a little bit circuitous, and so if that's of interest, I can tell that story.
Yeah.
I'll try to tell the Reader's Digest condensed version of it. But basically, I had published, or we hadn't yet put it out. It was in layout and edits. My previous book, Fun City Cinema,
Amazing. Everyone
New
needs that
York
one.
City, and
Yes.
the movies that made it. And this is for Abrams, as you can see right there.
Yes.
And Abrams' specialty really are kind of, large format, heavily illustrated, but they really also take the time and the care to also have accompanying text of substance. They've published a lot of great film books, Adam Nayman's books,
Yeah.
a bunch of Matt Zoller Seitz's film and TV books, his Wes Anderson collections. Those are all from Abrams. So that's their stock and trade. And I had a really nice time doing this book for them. It wasn't one that I had initially seen as an illustrated book. I had seen it more as a non-illustrated sort of, book like that.
Yeah.
But I had a really wonderful experience working with them. They were happy apparently with the work that I had done. Um, and while we were putting that book to bed, basically, I wrote something for the playlist, an anniversary piece about the John Candy movie, Only the Lonely.
Oh, I love
Um,
that movie.
Terrific movie. It was like, it
Yeah.
was a number of note anniversary. And when you are a film writer, you write a lot of those. But
Yep.
Jameson Stoltz, who is who runs the Abrams Press imprint, which does non-illustrated books, reached out to me after that piece was published, and he said, there hasn't really been a John Candy biography.
Hmm.
There had been one sort of quickie one that came out like a year or less after he passed, and then that was it. He said, "You really seem to have some interesting things to say about him. Would you ever consider writing a sort of, doorstop, top to bottom, cradle to grave biography?" Because I never had. The
Hmm.
closest I had come was, I had a Woody Allen book, which was written right before the
Yeah.
some things. But this is a film companion. It's just a film by film.
Yeah.
It's a critical analysis of the body of work. It's not a biography.
No.
I wrote a book called Richard Pryor, American Id.
Yeah.
But it's not, it came out like on the heels of two like actual Richard Pryor biographies, excellent ones. This is not a biography. It's sort of a series of essays about significant works of his that share common themes and sort of tackles his work again, but not so much of his life. This is not a Richard Pryor was born on December 8th, 1940, and it's not one of those.
No.
And I've always sort of been afraid to write one of those. Um, it seemed to me a really specific challenge to do one that was great.
Yes.
And by that I mean, and I want to be very, because I don't want to shade anybody here. I read a lot of entertainment biographies. It's one of the cornerstones of my sort of reading menu.
Mhm.
That's,
They run
as
the
some,
gamut. Yeah.
yeah, and as someone who studies movies, writes about them,
Mhm.
that's just, that makes sense to read. That's my field of interest. So I read a
Yep.
lot of them. And I've found that in my sort of observation, as he sort of came to me with this idea, I said, it seems to me that it seems really pretty easy to write a perfectly fine entertainment biography. By that I mean these are naturally interesting people.
Yep.
They've led inherently dramatic
Oh
lives,
yeah.
excuse me.
Hmm.
Um, they did a lot of interesting stuff. They were in, all of these films, or did, made all of these albums, or were in all of these TV shows, or whatever they did. And you could, so, if you sort of dig into everything that they did, do an adequate amount of research, talk to some people, and sort of line everything up in the right order, you can have a perfectly readable and even enjoyable book.
Yes.
And I've read a lot of those. I have only read a handful of great entertainment biographies where I really came away from the book feeling like I know this person, or I understand their life in some way that I wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah.
I feel like Carrie Corrigan's Elaine May book is like that. Mark Harris's Mike Nichols book is like that. Peter Guralnick's Elvis books are like that, but it's a fairly short list. And I was extremely daunted by that idea of trying to. I knew I could write an adequate one, but I didn't know how capable I was of writing a really good one. And I wanted to write a really good one, but then that became sort of okay. Well, you can keep on, sort of churning out, critical analysis books or whatever. Like, let's take the challenge. Let's try the thing that you're afraid of. And so I said, okay, let's go. Um, and so we did a contract to write a biography of John Candy, who
Yep.
at that time we believed no one was writing a book about. And then shortly after I got started, I found out that someone was. The very fine Canadian comedy chronicler Paul Myers had been working on a John Candy book for quite some time, and which I discovered as I was sort of knee deep in the research, and then I sort of was like, oh, well, I'm sure he's taking a different approach. I didn't want to flush away the work at that point. And so then I started putting out my interview asks, which I never do until I've done at least a fair amount of research in case
Mhm.
someone is like, yes, let's talk on Tuesday, and I'm like, so, when I started putting out the interview asks, I was getting no replies, no yeses, no, not even any passes, just nothing.
Mhm.
And then shortly after that, they announced that Ryan Reynolds was producing a documentary about John Candy,
Uh,
directed by Colin Hanks.
okay.
Um, and so everyone who I needed to talk to write
Yeah.
the great John Candy biography that I was only interested in writing had already talked to one or both of them, and I wasn't going to get anybody. And
Mhm.
so my publisher and I sort of regrouped, and he said, well, I would still really like to do a biography with you. Is there anyone else you're interested in writing about? And I, I, you know, it may just be because Candy was on my mind because I just spent the last few months with him. But I sort of naturally, the first thought I had was, oh, well, here's another terrific actor who was taken from us far too soon, who, probably didn't take the best care of himself, and that's probably why. And who we spend a lot of time speculating about the kind of work he might have done had he not left us. It just seemed very natural. Like that was just sort of the first other subject that popped into my head. And Jameson, my editor, was like, let's do it, because Abrams Press a couple years earlier had put out the Sopranos sessions by Matt Zoller Seitz and Alan Sepinwall, and it had sold very well for them. So he's like, I know there is a market here. Let let's go for it. And
Yeah.
so that was sort of how the book came to be. There were a few more bumps along the way, but in the interest of not giving you a 10-minute answer, that was the origin story for the book.
Great. Well, our friend, another fellow film critic, Sean Burns,
Hey,
for
Sean.
people who might not know, he is a Boston-based film critic who writes for WBUR. He paid you a really good compliment when I started reading this because he was reading it at the same time. And he
Yeah,
said, most of these celebrity bios, I want to skip over the first part, the early years. But in this case, it's just so fascinating and so well
that's great.
written, that
I
all
mean,
through college. Yeah, it
he
really
told he
is.
he told me that, and I was like, dude, same. Like I am a bad skimmer on the early years, and really that informed sort of the approach where it was like, I didn't. I knew that because of the kind of reader I was, that I wanted to write the kind of book I want to write. So I was like, I don't want to zip through this, but I certainly don't feel like we have to spend the first, 100 pages on his high school and college years. But I did try to at least I was lucky enough to hear some really interesting stories about his sort of entry into acting, his
Yeah.
high school persona, the kind of guy he was in high school, who is maybe not what you would expect if you just know
No,
him
no.
from the work. He was first of all thin, handsome son of a bitch. Like I mean, this guy he
Played
had like the
basketball. Yeah.
basketball player. There's like a basketball action shot from the
Yeah.
yearbook that we got into the book. He had like the John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever haircut.
Very like New Jersey Italian handsome, like amazing. Well, he was always handsome, but yes.
Yes, yes. Voted class flirt
Yeah,
in the senior
which
yearbook.
anyone who's met an actor ever, of course.
So yeah, it was fun to sort of to get into that period and to try to understand where the love for acting came from, and really from what I was told by people who saw him on stage and by his high school drama director, who I was lucky enough to talk to, that he really
Oh,
was just like David Chase called him a Mozart. And that was certainly like backed up by what I was told by his drama teacher, that he said he walked in cold for the first audition and just knocked everybody off their feet, that he clearly just had a gift naturally, that of course he fine-tuned and honed
yeah.
throughout the years, but that he was starting with a real gift.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot there. What I'm saying is, if you're watching this, pick up the book because you are going to want to learn about his upbringing and the first part of his life for sure. There are so many colorful and insightful stories in this book, especially about his 90s film work, which I find
Hmm.
really fascinating because that's when
Same.
I think most of us started to take note of, hey, who is this guy and Get Shorty and
Hmm.
True Romance and all of these things.
Yeah.
Civil Action, who, he's on screen for just little bits of time and you're drawn
Hmm.
right to him.
Very
One
much.
of my favorite stories about his preparation and just what he was like on sets, that's very colorful and very great in the book, is about Denzel Washington with Crimson Tide. Do you want to tell that story?
I mean, this was, I talked to one of his co-stars from Crimson Tide, the actor Rocky Carroll, and he told me some great stuff, but this was a story that I discovered when I was doing my deep dive into the clippings files, which is one of the it's probably my favorite part of the entire process. I go to the New York Public Library, and the librarians there for decades have clipped every item about every actor, every film, every
Yeah.
director, and they just have these incredible files, these resources. And so I had pulled the files for every film he was in, and I found this clipping from Crimson Tide about Crimson Tide from Premiere Magazine. I know you remember Premiere Magazine, Jen.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
I had a subscription as a kid,
as did
of
I,
course.
as did
Yep.
I. But like the on-set report for Crimson Tide, Ari Posner was the name of the writer of the piece, and I'm just reading this thing, and it says, and then and then said, and suddenly the actor in the scene with him, James Gandolfini, and I'm like, boop, in tennis, um, grabs him a little harder than he had in the rehearsal, and Washington shoves him, and Gandolfini responds in kind, and suddenly they're about to come to blows on the set of Crimson Tide. This was as you can imagine, a
Yeah.
movie in that sort of a tight setting, all men,
Oh, yeah.
all of these swinging dicks in this like close
Yep.
proximity. Every all of these young actors trying to show, trying to earn their bones, and
Yep.
and look good in front of, the two Oscar winners in the leading roles. Um,
Yeah.
but and it's this great story about, Jim not treating the movie star with kid gloves because he
Nope.
felt like that was not like that was robbing the scene of its integrity, that he was going to put his hands on him in that scene, and he wasn't going to fake it.
Nope.
um and it's a wonderful story because you really do, you get a sense of how serious he was about the work even when he was just doing a small character role like this.
Yeah. Yeah. He needed to pull him out just like in the part. Yeah.
Hmm. But also then, there's a great story that his agent told me about him, calling her from the car on the way home at the end of the day saying, "Yeah, I'm probably getting fired. I shoved Denzel too hard and we kind of got into it, and I think they're gonna fire me." And then proceeding to tell her like two or three actors he was friendly with who he
Yeah.
thought she should recommend to the producers when they called her to tell her that he was fired. And she's like, "Jim, buddy, that's not how it works. I don't offer up a swap in if they're firing you." But luckily for him, they didn't fire him. And in fact, Rocky Carroll, again, who I interviewed, said that he thinks ultimately, it was a heated moment, but ultimately that Denzel respected
Yeah,
that, that he was fully committed to the scene and the way he was. And then they became very good friends and made two more films together over the
absolutely.
ensuing years. So, you never know how these friendships are going to begin, I guess.
Yeah, I loved it. And something I also loved as a character actor nerd was his relationship with Susan Aston. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah, and his preparation, especially with Sopranos. I'm sure you can go into that. But first, there's something that he would say, or she would tell him, remind him, like, what's the worst that can happen? We suck,
Yeah.
which I love so much because I remember years ago, I talked to an actor who wanted to be on my podcast, Watch with Jen, and he's like, I'd rather just talk to you about it, over the phone. And so he gave me a call. Within the first 5 minutes, I had never talked to him in my life. He's telling me, like, yeah, I was on the set of something in Spain, and I hate this effing producer, and my kid wants to drop out of college in like 5 minutes. And he's like, what do you think I should do? And I'm like, I don't know you. And
Yeah.
so I happened to be at the time I had just gotten involved with another actor, and I asked him, I'm like, what is the deal with you guys like bearing your soul in the first two
Yeah.
minutes? And he didn't really think that was bizarre, and he just
Yeah.
like, doesn't everybody do that? And then he thought
Yeah.
about it and he goes, you know what it is? It's because we have to know, can we trust this person right away? And can we build a rapport?
Yeah.
And then we also have to know, like, am I comfortable failing in front of
Hmm.
300 people with you as
Right.
my scene partner? So I guess that's just what we do. And I
Yeah.
love that about Gandolfini and the story of, like, what's the worst that can happen? We suck. It isn't
Yeah.
brain surgery, but they're playing the
Right.
stuff you talked about with him and Delroy Lindo, like barking at each other like dogs. It was
Hmm.
great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Susan was, I believe, the very first interview that I conducted. I sat in her living room, on the Upper West Side for 2+ hours one afternoon, and just got as much out of her as she could give. And it was if you're when you're lucky, you get a first interview that's that robust, because it really can end up sort of pointing your way in terms of the story that you're ultimately going to tell. And a lot of things that were not yet clear to me about the book became clear to me just after those 2 hours with her. That I really came away from it with all of this great stuff that she had given me about his process,
Yes.
about, the Gandolfini method, if you will.
Yeah.
Um, and I realized that, beyond the sort of standard celeb biography thing, that could be another thing that this book could hopefully accomplish. That
Yeah.
if a young actor who admires James Gandolfini reads it and wants to know how he achieved this
Yes.
incredible work, I want them to come away with some ideas, with some notion of how he built a character, how he did scene work, how he memorized lines, like all of the sort of nuts and bolts that went into the performances that he gave, that sort of knocked us all out. That all seems so completely unstudied,
Yeah.
completely off the cuff, totally natural. Well, actually, that kind of naturalism takes a whole lot of work.
Oh my God.
um
Yes.
and the best actors will tell you that. So she really laid all of that out for me in a wonderful way, because this is Susan Aston is someone who met him when they were both struggling young actors in New York City in the late 1980s. She got him into an off Broadway play that she was in, and that they were trying to fill the male. There was a three-hander, and they were trying to fill the male role on it. And they got on so well that they continued to sort of improv together and do scene study together. And then a playwright kind of built a duet play for them that they worked on and expanded and performed through the years. And so she just became sort of his most trusted advisor. And when he started getting more substantial film work, he would call her from California, call her apartment in New York and be like, I'm lost here. Help me figure this character out. And they would do that stuff over the phone. And it became a more formal arrangement when The Sopranos started. He said, he told them, he said, I
Yeah.
need Susan's help, for the amount of work that I'm doing here, for the amount of lines I'm memorizing, for the, initially they were shooting episodes in 8 days in that first season. He
That's
just needed help.
amazing. Yeah.
So she came on initially sort of as in an unofficial capacity, and then by the third episode she was in the end credits as dialogue coach,
Mm.
and maintained that job throughout the rest of the run. Did that work with him on all the films he did during the show, and then every film he made after it. She was his one-on-one acting coach, and he gave her credit for that every opportunity that he had.
Yes. No, I thought that was such a great thing that's in your book. It's, exactly what you were saying, just like listening in character. It looks easy. That isn't an easy thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
Or thinking in character, just the
Hmm.
amount of things he was able to convey. Like, I think it was in your book when he was talking about working with John Travolta and how he was like kind of mesmerized that it didn't look like Travolta was doing much.
Doing
Camera was
anything.
on him, anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just like what he can achieve and how much he can convey. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That he said that when they were doing they have this really wonderful scene in Get Shorty. They ended up becoming very
Yeah.
good friends.
Yeah.
Travolta was an idol for him as like a young actor,
Oh,
coming of age
yeah.
in New Jersey, and gave him credit for that. And actually said that his dad, I want to say like Travolta's dad sold tires or
Tire
something like.
shop. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And his dad would go in to just, that was his tire shop. He would go there to buy tires, but he would
Yes.
see Travolta's picture up on the wall, and somehow that sort of, 3 degrees of separation
Yes.
made a career as an actor seem palpable to him in a way that it never did before. But they ended up, making 4 films together, became very good friends. But when they were doing that first one, when they were doing Get Shorty, their sort of key scene together, what the wonderful scene out in the parking garage where Travolta has sort of flipped Gandolfini, sort of beat him up, but then he's asking him about the fact Gandolfini's character Barry used to be a stuntman, and he's asking him about some of the stunts and some of the films that
I
he
love
worked
that
on,
scene.
and he's like
Yeah, in the
mesmerized.
parking
It's
garage. Yeah.
it's a wonderful sort of human, unexpected connection between these two guys. And he said that, yeah, that when they were shooting that scene, he was sort of baffled because it really seemed like Travolta wasn't doing
Mhm.
anything.
Mhm.
But this was a guy who's been working on film for so long by that point,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, 20 years by then. He knows instinctively where a camera is, the
Mhm.
lens that's on it, exactly how much to do to communicate what he's thinking and what he's feeling without going overboard. And he said he learned a lot from him.
Yeah. Well, the Sopranos cast has been largely very loyal, of course, protective,
Hmm.
tight-lipped, understandably. So was it hard to get people to trust you? They, wanted to make sure you weren't doing a hatchet job and this was all out of
Right.
love, getting them to open up to you. And also just what were some of your favorite discoveries about the Sopranos era? Because yeah, I loved learning about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was a tricky balance because I knew going in it was important to me that the Sopranos, to get the balance of how much Sopranos is in there
Yeah.
right,
Mhm.
because it's not going to be a Sopranos book.
No.
There are plenty of Sopranos
Oh
books,
gosh, yes.
really good ones. The Sopranos Sessions is excellent.
Yeah.
Woke Up This Morning, which is the oral history from the podcast, terrific. But and sort of one of the big ideas that I had going in was that I wanted to reclaim Gandolfini as a multifaceted performer, that there was much more to him as an actor than that one role. But that also was his iconic role. That was 10 years of his life. Like you're not gonna, yada yada the Sopranos when you're writing a
No.
book about James Gandolfini. So it was important to me to just to kind of to get that balance right. Um, and luckily, I was told so many good stories
Yeah.
that really, uh, that ended up being about how much of it there was just everything that I wanted to include. Um,
Mhm.
they were, the it was an interesting kind of mixture of trust and how much they wanted to tell or how explicit they wanted to be
Oh
about
yeah. Hmm.
because the way that sort of that the interview piece of this came together was I had started the research and I started putting out interview asks and was really coming up snake eyes. Like I was
Yeah.
not I was getting a lot of no's, I was getting a lot of ghosts, I was like not getting much in the way of positive response.
Hmm.
um to the point where we had actually pulled the plug on the book for a minute and were going to regroup again just because it seemed like we were going to be in the same situation where we weren't going to be able to get our interviews. But then, in the process of sort of figuring out the book, I had pitched to my editor friend Hillary at Vanity Fair the idea of doing just kind of a remembrance of Valentine to Gandolfini because the 10th anniversary of his passing was coming up.
Yeah.
Um, and she had approved that. So I was like, well, I still at least need to do that. So let me just do that. Well, unsurprisingly, when you're putting out asks to write something for Vanity Fair, you're going to get a more enthusiastic response than when you're
That
some
helps.
schmuck with a Gmail address. So then, interviews start falling into place. And I got so much good material from those interviews that couldn't make it into that slender, whatever 2,000 word piece, that it became a situation of, well, geez, I mean, even if I only have these interviews, I've got enough to probably write the book. And that piece was so well received that it became very clear to me and to my editors at Abrams Press that we should go ahead and go with this book. And then in turn, having that Vanity Fair piece to send out with future interview inquiries was a huge help in sort of establishing my credibility and the perspective I was coming from. When I
Mhm.
was talking to that initial batch of folks, and that was when I spoke to most of the Sopranos cast, not all, but most was in that initial thing. When you're doing that sort of a piece and these are people who are in demand, you're getting 15 or 30 minutes. So you're going to get, I don't want to cast aspersions. You're going to get the greatest hits. You're going to get their
Yeah.
favorite Jim stories. You're going to get the funniest or warmest or most memorable pieces of his story. And I was happy to have all of that.
Yeah.
After the piece ran, like I said, I used that, I reached back out to all of their publicists. I want to make sure it's clear that I didn't do anybody dirty. We reached back out to all their
Yeah.
publicists and said, hey, we're going to turn this into a book,
Yeah.
let me know if that's a problem and we won't, use any of this material. And fortunately, no one did. But as I reached out to, then I started to reach out um, to use the parlance of the industry, the below the line folks, the
Yeah.
people who were writing staff, production crew, smaller roles, and a couple of the actors who I just wasn't able to sort of get the timing right to get into the Vanity Fair piece. And with those folks, number one, I wasn't under the same kind of time constraints. We were able to carve out more like an hour or two to talk to each of
Mhm.
them. But also, because they're not public figures who will
Yes.
have
Yeah.
things to answer to or in
Mhm.
then interviews that are going to sort of prod, they felt, I think, a little more free to tell some of the trickier pieces of the
Yeah.
story. And that was really where some of the elements of the book about some of the struggles that he had on the set, some of
Mhm.
his struggles with substance abuse,
Yeah.
some of the stuff that doesn't go into the 10th anniversary of his passing Valentine piece,
Oh.
but
Uh-huh.
that is a pretty essential piece of telling the story
Right.
of his entire life.
Yeah.
So that was where a lot of that material began to present itself. And then, you find out one thing or a couple of other things. The next person you talk to, you say, well, I heard this story from so and so about this. Do you recall that? And they will say, yeah, sure. And that was, or, well, I don't remember that, but there was this time that,
Yeah.
um, and then I, after that, did a couple of follow-up interviews with a couple of the name actors who I could feel in our interview were sort of skirting around the edges of this stuff, but maybe didn't want to go
Yeah.
into it.
Hmm.
I was able to go back and say, hey, you kind of started to go here and then you wanted to go off the record, or, you sort of backed away. And I heard these stories from these folks, and if you're comfortable, I'd love to get into that a little bit more. And they were willing to do that in really protective and
Oh,
pointed
yeah.
ways, but I hope that by then, based on what I had already published and the very tentative spirit in which I was approaching this material, it was so important to me that it didn't feel ghoulish, that it didn't feel
Oh, no.
salacious or
Mhm.
exploitative, or like I was digging for dirt here. I just wanted to be honest. I just wanted to tell the whole story, because I think when you understand what that character, playing that character for that long of a period, did to him, I think you understand his ultimate journey a little more. I think you have a little more sympathy and empathy for what he was going through. And I think also appreciate the quality of the work a little bit more, to know how much turmoil he sometimes had to go through to get to the dark places that it required.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you went there, because that was actually going to be my next question. Is I do really applaud the respectful way that you handled it. You didn't put the rose-colored glasses on or hide anything, but it's with empathy. It's humanistic, because he is such a big-hearted, messy,
Yeah.
yet lovable presence. These are all larger than life individuals, and he really was. So that must have been a hard balance to strike, but I'm glad that you addressed that. And I think all of those aspects and playing that part in the hours that he had to keep,
Yeah.
essentially, like, you know, going 18-hour days, or the Fridays where you're there till, or what was it called, like Fraturdays, something like
Saturdays. Yeah.
Friday and
Yeah.
Saturday, 'cause you're there the
They
whole
would
time.
when they would work a long day, especially early when they were turning
Wow.
these in, a week or two, you
Yeah.
could work so many hours. Once you broke for the day, you had to take X number of hours off before you could come back. And it would become this sort of sliding thing where, because of that break, which is important, they would start later and later every day and then go later and later. So they would start later the following. It become this domino effect to where, yeah, they were shooting. There were times when they would start so late on Friday that like they would be working until like after the sun came up on Saturday. Um, that piece of it, like I said, going in, my main concern, my main fear was, writing a book that was better than adequate.
Hmm.
Once I started getting into this material in both the interviews and in the research, that became the most important part to me, to deal with that material in a way that was respectful and empathetic, and not sort of scandal mongering and salacious,
No.
which I say partly because like I've worked as an online entertainment journalist
Oh,
for,
yeah.
a
Hmm.
decade and a half now. I know how clickbait works. I know that when the book comes out, I mean, we've had excerpts that have come out that have been, the most sort of salacious stuff has been pulled out and aggregated and, blasted on headlines, and,
Hmm.
that's just how the industry works.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that nothing in the approach that I was taking was lending itself to that, or making that easy for anyone with those sort of intentions. It comes from a fairly personal place. I mean,
Yeah.
I have drug addiction in my family, very
Hmm.
close to me in my family. I have alcoholism in
Yeah.
my family. I know what it is to go through these struggles, to be in proximity to these struggles.
Yes.
But the other thing too that really stuck out is, a lot of, when to give an easy example, when you read about John Belushi's substance abuse,
Yeah.
like, you're reading about how he was wrecking productions, how he was making things unsafe for people, and some are still sort of mad about it.
Hmm.
To a person, everyone who told me any story of Jim's unreliability, of his demons, which is what they all called it. Anyone who told me that story still loved him so much
Yes.
and took such pains to say, in spite of all of this, I would have never have traded the opportunity to know him, to work with him, to do this show. He was all, and always had a story about how apologetic he was whenever something
Yeah.
had gone awry,
Yeah.
the sort of the gestures of kindness that he would do to sort of make up for it, like the
Yeah.
kid who feels
Exactly.
bad, who comes in, hat in hand. So that also, it felt like to sensationalize that material would really be a betrayal of how they felt about him.
Oh,
um
100%. Yeah.
so I wanted to be respectful of that as well.
Yes. Well, looking over his Sopranos era, we should probably talk about how that started, how he got the role. I know that a lot of people are curious about that. I love the two other people who were up in the three. I can see Rispoli doing it, Van Zant. I think that's great. So,
Yeah,
anything you want to talk about the beginning of Sopranos and the fact that
sure.
it did span from 34 to 43, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
They shot the
Yeah.
pilot in 1997, and then had a long break before they shot the rest of the first season, and then it was completely shot and edited and everything before it aired in early '99, and then the last episode aired in 2007. So yeah, it was almost a decade of his life. Um, I will plug a little bit that actually today Vulture ran an excerpt from the book that is specifically the section about how he got cast.
Oh, okay.
If you'd like to read ahead, if you're still deciding if you're going to buy the book or not, you can take a look at that.
Buy the
But
book.
but it came to him in a sort of a roundabout way. He had always considered himself a film and stage actor. First and foremost, he did not want to do TV. He had only done like one TV appearance of note. He appeared in an episode of an anthology series that Robert Altman produced with a lot of other movie stars. So it seemed
Yeah,
like
yeah.
sort of, an okay thing to do. But he'd been offered, and this was one of, there are not, I don't, it's not a scoop kind of book. There are not a lot of scoops in it. But there are a few pieces of information that I got mostly from his management and agents, that I had not encountered in any of the material I read, at least. And one of them was that he was offered the leading role in ABC's American adaptation of the British crime show Cracker with Robbie Coltrane.
Love,
Um,
love that
they
show.
Yeah, it's a great show. They
Yeah.
did an American version of it that wasn't as good. But they had offered him that. They didn't make him read for it or anything. They just they had seen him in the movies, and they romanced him. They flew out. They were really trying to get him to do it, and he ultimately turned it down because he didn't want to do TV. He told his manager, he said, "I just can't see myself in like some goofy commercial hanging off the ABC sign." He didn't he it wasn't that kind of work for him. But this obviously was a really special script. This was very different from doing something on ABC. Um, and David Chase was not your typical showrunner. He had been in television for decades, but this was a show that he had shopped around, that all of the networks had turned down. That and this is what's insane is when you talk about The Sopranos now, especially to viewers who weren't around when it first aired, everything that was so sort of mind-boggling and groundbreaking about it seems so absolutely uneventful now, because this is what television became. But like
Yeah.
at the time, the idea of a show where the central character was a killer, was an anti-hero, was someone you could not in good conscience quote unquote root for, that was anathema to network television. You did not have a show where you had a remotely disreputable protagonist. You just didn't do that, you know. So this kind of thinking was how he landed at HBO. And the other thing then that people don't believe you when you tell them, if they're of a certain age, is that HBO didn't do dramas when they did The Sopranos. They were mostly still known for running theatrical films about a year after they came out. They did some original programming. They had, sports. They had live sports and comedy specials, and they had had some success with half-hour sitcoms or comedies of some kind, and they had just sort of had a big hit with Sex and the City, but like that was still all very new territory for
Mhm.
them. The only hour-long drama they'd had just premiered before they picked up this show, which was Oz.
Yeah.
So this
Mhm.
idea of, an hour-long weekly dramatic series on HBO seemed sort of unthinkable. Like, what would that even be? What would that even look like? Of course, that was great because that allowed Chase and his team to make kind of whatever crazy, wild, non-heroic, cinematic show that they wanted to do. So this was a pretty, the script was knocking around for a while from network to network and sort of almost getting greenlit, but not quite. And it actually made its way to Jim because his managers also represented Mark Helgenberger. And she had a show go to pilot, I think for CBS, and Chase had sent in that script as a writing sample to be a potential writer on that show. So as Marg's representation, Jim's managers, Nancy Sanders and Mark Armstrong, had read that script and were really blown away by it. And they were like, wow, nobody's ever going to make this show, but this is some great writing. And then when she heard that he had made the deal with HBO and that they were at least going to go to pilot on it, she went back and reread that script and suddenly just knew. She's like, oh, this Jim has to do this. He has to, this is your guy. And sent over his tape and started talking to David Chase about him. Chase, who had, I think, seen some of his softer work, actually said, it's like, I mean, he's a good actor, but is he threatening enough? And she said, David, if that's your concern, yeah, you're going to be fine. He's threatening enough. Like, and I think probably sent him, a copy of True Romance or something. Um, but it was a convoluted audition process, which we go into in the book, very sort of stop and start and go here and reschedule it. He was extremely nervous. He left the audition midway through the first time because he was certain he was blowing it.
Mhm.
um and also had these qualms and this uncertainty about being on a television show.
Yeah.
um on top of all of that, had also sworn off doing any more mob roles. He didn't want
Yeah.
to play any more
Mhm.
gangsters. He had done a lot of them in films and was sort of embarrassed of them.
Yeah.
And like when it would be like ashamed to tell his friends or his parents to go see him play like yet another Italian gangster. He just didn't
Mhm.
like doing that stuff anymore. But they finally sort of talked him into it. He did the audition. He knocked them out. He went in to read for the HBO suits, and there was down to three actors. It was down to him, to Michael Rispoli, who played Jackie Aprile ultimately
Yeah.
on the show, another terrific character actor,
Love him.
and Stevie Van Zandt was the third option for that because Chase had seen him like out of his sort of little Stevie get up, in a suit and tie, giving an awards at or award at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and thought he just had that quality that he was looking for. So they offered him the role, and he still had to be talked into it by his management. And ultimately what they said was, look, it's a drama series on HBO. Like nobody's probably going to see it. So like what harm could this do? Just go do it. It'll be a good credit. You'll do some of the best work you've ever done. Maybe nobody will see it, but you'll have done it. And he ultimately was sort of like, okay, fine, whatever, and signed and then went and made television history and became a superstar. Like that's always how it's never the thing that you think is actually going to be, your big moment.
Yeah, I was rewatching some of my favorite episodes again in preparation, and I got kind of stuck in the first season. I love the first episode, of course, him and the ducks, and
Mm-hmm.
and then I watched College,
Yeah.
which is such a killer episode, and that's where we see him be a killer, and
Yeah.
also his daughter Meadow starting to figure
Mm-hmm.
out what her dad does. She probably has always known, of course, but
Yeah.
actually confront him about it. And as you talk about, the show gets progressively just darker and darker and darker. And
Yeah.
what it did to Jim, I think, to make the show, of course. I think it's really important too. You talk about his relationships with the remarkable actors that he is on the series with and his loyalty to them, giving a
Yeah.
part of his, salary on the QT, essentially writing checks to people. I love, there was a quote from Drea de Matteo, like how much, which was but also just, some of the things he would do, being a grip one day, throwing things in the truck, and just, I loved
Hmm.
all of those stories. Yeah. And
Yeah.
also some of the stuff you talked about, like his working relationship with Edie Falco, which I didn't know about. Yeah.
No, yeah. Edie was one of the people I was lucky enough to talk to twice. And she told me really, what was fascinating, I think, about him was he really was kind of, it's my understanding, was kind of the acting partner that every that each different person needed him to be to
Yes.
get their best performance.
Yeah.
So when with someone like Vince Curatola, who is kind of a chatterbox, who wants to just sort of like hang out and shoot the shit between takes,
Yep.
um, he was that for him. They had a really warm, convivial, they would sit around and talk about TCM. They would talk about their favorite old
Yes.
movies. And that was their relationship. With Edie, she said they didn't really have much of an off-screen relationship. They each sort of came, they were very different actors in terms of how they approached the work. She said, was much sort of looser and improvisational, at least about blocking. He never went off the page on the
No.
words, but in terms of trying different things within the lines, different movements, things like that, she would come in like very locked in, and
Yep.
but would sort of take the his lead and sort of let herself go a little bit more. But she told me, and I thought this was so fascinating, she said, I think there was a part of me that just needed to have the relationship that Carmela had with Tony.
Yeah.
That I just wanted to work to be with him on that level and to have that very special dynamic in place. And then we didn't do a lot of chit chat in between takes or in between scenes or things like that. We were sort of in our own space. And then, that like several years after the show ended, they went out to dinner one night at the Tribeca Grill. And she said, first of all, caught a lot of stares.
Yeah.
Um, but that dinner, years after the show was off the air, was really the longest personal conversation that they had maybe ever had. And really kind of like bonded that night because they'd been through this incredible thing together, and really each other were the only ones who fully understood what that experience had been. It's kind of a lovely story, and she talked about it with such warmth and affection. It was clearly like a really cherished memory for her.
Oh, I'm so glad that she shared that with you and
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
sharing it with us.
Yeah.
Well, I know that at 7 there's another event here, so I'll leave this as my last question for you.
Okay.
If you guys are
Since
watching,
you take
well,
10 minutes to answer every question, Bailey,
no,
I'll
no,
give you one.
no, no, I love it. Because you and I could do this for like hours. And
Yes.
if you are listening and you want to know more, we're going to be covering some of your favorite unsung performances of James Gandolfini on my
Yep.
podcast, Watch with Jen, in a
Yep.
couple of weeks. So there will be like a part 2 of
Yes.
this for sure.
Exactly.
But before I let you go, people who are watching now, are there any movies or any of those films that you want to give a shout out to that people should see if they really only know them from Tony Soprano and The Sopranos
Right.
that they need to watch? Yeah.
The first movie I always tell people who want to know more, who want to see more, who want to see a different side is I send them to Enough Said, which was
I love that.
sadly
Yeah.
um, a posthumous release. It was the second to last movie he made, and it came out a few months after he passed in 2013. It's directed by Nicole Holofcener, co-stars Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and was his only romantic comedy leading man turn.
Yeah.
So first of all, right there, you can't do a romantic comedy about Tony Soprano. Um, Not that he couldn't be romantic or funny as that character, but it's not sort of built into the DNA of it. But to a person, every interview I gave, when that if that movie came up either directly or indirectly, um, what they told me every single time was, "Oh yeah, that was Jim." That was here, this Nancy Sanders, who was one of his managers. He was terrified because he was as vulnerable and real and James Gandolfini as he was ever gonna be. Those were his Birkenstocks. That's who he was. If anybody wants to know who Jim Gandolfini was, he was the closest to that character. And the guy he's playing in this is so sensitive and sweet and vulnerable. He's this big teddy bear of a guy. She hurts him really badly in the course of the
I
movie, and
know.
he shares that pain with you. Like, he kind of breaks your heart. He's also warm and wonderful in their romantic scenes together. There's the first time they kiss, the way he says it to her, he's just sort of looking at her and grinning. He's like, "Want to kiss?" And she's immediately like, "Yep." And like, you would too, it's so sweet and kind. And so that, to me, is the role that is maybe the greatest illustration of his range as an actor. And that, like I said, was really one of the things I was hoping to put across over the course of the book, was like, this was an actor of tremendous range. There was, as best as I could tell, nothing he couldn't do. But that film in particular is like, if all you know is Tony Soprano, it will knock your hair off.
Yeah, it is one of my favorites for sure. Just such a beautiful movie, warm, sad, funny, everything. Nicole
Yeah.
Center, one of my faves. I
Yeah.
also would recommend In the Loop for sure,
Yes.
which we're going to be
Yes.
talking about. That's a good one. And Not Fade Away. If you are a
Yeah.
fan of The Sopranos, David Chase, Not Fade Away, they work together again. Just such a great movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And
yeah.
both of those really do illustrate kind of the range and what he could do with the baggage that he brought as Tony Soprano. In the Loop is, again, a completely different character from either Enough Said or Tony Soprano.
Yeah.
That he's playing like a career military man. He's playing like a Norman Schwarzkopf type character. He's this button up, general, and he's speaking in this sort of clipped nasal voice that was much closer to his real voice. And it's an incredibly funny performance. It's Armando Iannucci, who famously uses a lot of improvisation, and you
Yeah.
really get a glimpse of his comic gifts, his comic timing, and also his skill at improvisation. Like, he keeps right up with everybody in that cast. And then Not Fade Away, he's playing a character who kind of looks and sounds like Tony Soprano. He's a Jersey dad, but
Yeah.
it's a much more middle class, working class dude. He like works at a hardware store. And he finds the sort of the nuances of that particular kind of guy, like a middle-aged man in the 1960s who's watching his son get into like rock and roll and rebellion, and has opinions about it. So that's a fun counterpoint sort of to Tony Soprano as well. And like you said, written and directed by David Chase, his only feature film credit as a writer director, a really personal story about his own upbringing in Jersey and his early dreams of being a rock star.
Yeah, it's a really good one. Jason, I want to thank you so much for doing this. Everyone, go out and get Gandolfini, Jim Tony, and The Life of a Legend. This was just so much fun, and I can't wait to talk to you again in a couple
Thank
weeks
you.
on the pod. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you,
Thanks
Jason.
for having me, and thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Of course. Thank you.
All right, let's see. It's great. I was listening to it.
Oh, okay,
Great.
thank you. I guess somebody was saying there was an echo.
I was wondering about that. I'll have to go back.